Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a good opportunity to be here again. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. For those of you who are groaning because you've seen me before and are not looking forward to more economic information, I have good news for you, which is that I am not going to be up here for very long. The presentation is going to be more concise, kind of a recap of where we've been over these last 3 meetings, and then putting some questions out on the table for us to discuss. Ultimately, the purpose of my presentation is kind of be a little bit of a primer, and then ultimately clear the way for our honored guest, Jennifer Freeman from Jobs from the Future, which we're lucky to have. She brings a wealth of expertise in areas that she'll be able to share that Kevin and myself might not necessarily have as well. And this, in turn, will give us an opportunity to have conversation, ask questions. As I said, I'm going to be presenting more questions than I am answers. So with that, I think we will get going. So we're here today, September 2015. The leaves are slightly changing. Worried about a windstorm, but right now I'm enjoying them so far. For those who need a refresher, economic and labor market information. We are a federally funded division within the Vermont Department of Labor. We're part of a national data system, and we're here to provide information to help people make decisions. And that's today, you people, which is great. So I want people to ask questions. If you have questions, let's challenge the data, because the data cannot tell the entire story. Ultimately, I'm going to try and say my conclusions once in the front and then once in the back. The big 2 questions being, and these aren't really conclusions as they are questions, is we need to figure out how we can encourage focused participation in education and training from individuals who are seeking it, and we need to figure out how to create meaningful access to those who are looking to seek education and training. The 2 big questions. How do we increase focused participation, and how do we create meaningful access? And then for those who want to have side conversations, learn a little bit more about what's going on, maybe you didn't catch any of the first 3 presentations, which are going to be summarized very quickly, contact us about information, follow-up questions. If you have data questions or looking for information sources, Kevin and I will be happy to help. Appreciate Kevin's support in putting this presentation together. We work in tandem. Fortunately, I will be the mouthpiece today. Labor supply. So when you think about these concepts of what are the workforce needs of the state of Vermont, an economist, we love trying to figure out how can we talk about supply and how can we talk about demand. So let's first talk about labor supply, and this is a big recap of where we talked about. When we look at the Vermont economy and we talk about the labor force participation rate, the blue line being the labor force in the state of Vermont. This is the labor force from 2001 to present. This is a slide I've shown before. The highlight being is that we've peaked in our labor force participation, and over the last 6 years approximately, we've lost labor force in the state of Vermont. This is not so much a national Vermont phenomenon as a national phenomenon, such that the president said, Council of Economic Advisors, I want you to look into this. Why is the labor force contracting in the United States? Why is it contracting in Vermont? Is how I think he asked the question. He's concerned about our labor force participation rate. His economists came back with the 3 factors. The biggest one being demographics. It is clear and evident that there is a demographic shift going on with the baby boomers as they are easing into retirement. The lead edge of the baby boomers, I believe, are 69, which puts them 2 years over full qualifying age. But that's a whole generation, and this is going to be a phase that's going to be marching through. There are some other factors related to the recession, and then quote-unquote other factors related to changes in preferences, expectations. And this is a slide we showed you before, I believe in our first presentation, and even had follow-up conversation in our second presentation, which is when we look at the breakdown of labor force participations rates by age, the blue being US and the green being Vermont, we see that in the last 7 years, again, the labor force participation rate has declined, and it has declined most notably in youth. Again, a concern of how are young people gaining access to employment opportunities if they are participating at a lower rate. Again, this is just meant to be a highlight, overarching thing on labor supply. State of Vermont is experiencing pressure, downward pressure on our labor force related to demographics and changes in expectations and taste. Young people are staying out of the labor force longer, potentially pursuing more education, which can be considered a good thing. Less exposure to professionalism, that's a challenge potentially. But you flip the question around and say, well, what about labor demand? What does your data tell us about labor demand? What are employers looking for? Again, we're part of that federal system with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We produce information consistent with their methodology, and we're trying to get an understanding of what are employers looking for. So we have a program called Occupational Employment Statistics, the OES program, something we've talked about here, where we look at occupations in the Vermont economy. We actually survey employers and say, what are your jobs and how much do they pay? And we have trained coders or trained analysts and coders in our office that take job titles, like my job title is Economic and Labor Market Information Chief. That's not an occupational title. It's not something you can study and define and say what are the necessary skills and attributes associated with that. So we code jobs to occupations. And this gives us occupational data, which is a standardized data set based around coding and definitions. And we can say, well, what are employers looking at? And this gives us a historical look because it's only telling us what are the wages in the occupations that exist today. So in part of our participation with the Employment and Training Administration, who we're fortunate to have a representative here today. Thank you, Linda, for being here. Employment and Training Administration says, you know what, the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't go far enough. They're only allowing you to look at jobs in the rearview mirror. We want you to look at the jobs going forward. So we take a look at employment opportunities projected in the future based on changes in what we expect in the economy, changes in industry composition, changes in staffing patterns, and build occupational projections. And these occupational projections allow us to produce very valuable data, very rich data as it relates to what do we think the skills and demand for those skills are going to be in the future. And this is just a sample. And this is actually something I believe we've shown you before. We took a look at the data, we cut it by educational attainment level, and we said, okay, what are the fastest growing for those requiring a high school education? And you can take a look at these, and we'll circle back to some of these as we go forward. But we have growth rates over here, which is great if you love numbers, and it's got wage rates, which a lot of people can understand and have a relative scale that we can appreciate more so than the growth rates. And that's where the challenges of this data start entering. And even some of these, because this is, again, this data is produced in partnership with some federal organizations, and there's this organization called ONET, which actually takes a look at the jobs, the occupational titles, the occupational duties, and says, okay, I think this is the type of training platform, education necessary to gain access to that employment level. But if you look up here, you might even see something up here like medical secretaries. High school education, going to be hired directly into medical secretaries? I don't know. That's a question. You can start looking at this data and putting a questionable lens on it. For example, there's even one up here related to, where is it? So, no, that's not it. Where is the other one that I really liked? Even like industrial machinery mechanics coming right out of high school and being able to come into something like that. I could envision post-secondary education developed around those skills. We can come forward and look at associate's degrees, and you see more medical fields come up, more technical fields, and some of these ring true as far as opportunities. And bachelor's degrees. But again, this is just looking at what is the education level necessary to gain minimum exposure to it. You might not even be competitive in it. And when you're looking at job growth, you're not considering replacements. We do look at replacements and put that data together. So when we look at this data, it's like what questions is it trying to answer and how can we take it forward? Going back to the idea of, let's get focused participation, and we'll see how this translates going forward. Yes, Joan.
Sorry, you said the growth does not include the replacement?
This is strictly growth. Right. So when we're looking at our labor force, which is experiencing contracting, like employers are trying to potentially not even just maintain their level of employment, but they might be trying to grow. And these are where areas of growth will be. And so depending on how you cut the data, whether you're focused on growth rates, which these slides are, or replacements, you see a much different picture. And this is where we want to, this is what we've attempted to do here, is summarize what it means, like the labor demand, if you look at occupational projections. So Michelle is a big fan of this slide. She loves talking to us about it and coming down and saying, okay, well, let's take a look at this, what this really means. I've highlighted where the employment opportunities, again, these are employment opportunities. They could represent part-time or full-time. They're just a job of all different shapes and sizes. But you can see when you have less than a high school education, the bulk of the employment opportunities are going to be under that $15 wage level. I'll just tell you the reason the wages were cut this way. 21.17, I guess those are dollars and cents, I don't have to say it as a decimal. The 21.17 is the average wage in the state of Vermont. Averages can be a little bit blurry because just like an average sales on a home price, if you sell 10 homes at $200,000 and you sell one home for $1 million, the average is going to be lurched way to the right. Just like in wage data. 21.17 may be the average, but it is not the median. The median, the most likely number to be available. So we're looking at what is above the average. This group, Michelle provided us a cutoff, said let's just put a meaningful cutoff of $15. I believe she just picked that number out of the air. Is that kind of just, yeah. Let's create a 3-tier system, under $15, 15 to 21. And you can see with less than high school education, by ONET definitions, and we'll talk a little bit more about ONET, you can see that there's tremendous amount of opportunity for employment with less than high school education, but it's going to be on the lower wage pay scale. And as you move forward, you see that the blue box gets lower and lower and lower because education typically leads to higher wages. This becomes a question of economic justice. It's like, how do we provide meaningful access to individuals looking to advance themselves? But education for education's sake might not be that focused participation that we're looking for, because just because you have a BA or a bachelor's degree doesn't mean your skills can translate directly into employment or self-sufficiency. So just looking, even eyeballing how these numbers stack up, and we'll see this distribution in a percentage ways, you'll see there's a big block of employment that, as just to gain access to those jobs, don't require more than a high school education. Because you look at the high school education, the biggest group, then as you get to these post-secondary training in AA, you see a smaller group. But I think that's changing in terms of more employers are realizing the benefits of post-secondary training as it relates to certificates or AAs. So I anticipate this as a group or a share to be going up. But then you see BAs and MAs, that's where the access to these higher paying jobs are. So when we put this information together and we were trying to synthesize it, and again, I know there's a lot of information, I'm just trying to put topics on the table, get the wheels turning so that we can turn it over to our esteemed guests. Educational attainment of Vermont adults. So let's say, okay, we just looked at data, right, that said, what are the educational needs necessary for these employment opportunities? Well, let's take a look and see what we have for the Vermont population, match them up side by side, and let's just have a conversation. This is called challenges of assessing workforce needs for a reason, because it is difficult. Because this data that I've been talking about, you see me caveat it all through this conversation. You know, well, that data answers a certain question. This data answers a different question. How is the data cut? This is a challenge because people are people, and people make decisions. Economists, we love to just simplify everything and say, well, people are rational. They make good decisions based on their own personal preferences, right? But rational people, to what is rational to one person might not be rational to another. And we're not all income motivated such that we're just sitting here saying, how can I maximize my return on investment for education, or maximize my time so I'm selling to the highest bidder? People like sunny days, they like ice cream cones, they like foliage. These are things that are motivating people to make different choices than an economist would be able to truly recognize when you look at dollars and cents and educational attainment. But when you look at this, these are the percentages that we just talked about, the employment opportunities available in the state of Vermont. You see how many of them have a basic entry level requirements of less than high school education, about a quarter. Another 40% high school education. And remember, these are the same occupations that were on those fastest growth that we had questions about. Like I've even seen social workers be listed as like high school education. Common education level of many social workers in the state of Vermont is a master's degree, right? So just because there's an organization called ONET that says the minimum educational level necessary to get access to those doesn't mean these people are going to be competitive. So we can tell 60 some odd percent of the population that, if you got a high school degree, you should be all set. Doesn't mean they're going to be competitive in the modern economy. They're not going to be able to get the desirable job they want because we already saw where the wages are skewed, right, to the higher end. So, this is the big question. Is like, well, how do we assess the workforce, and how do we assess what the workforce needs are? If I go to school, initially I was a computer science major. If I had completed my degree as a computer science major, I guarantee within 3 years of working as a computer scientist, is that what they're called? I would have burned myself out and would have been out of there. Thankfully, within 2 years, I realized this was not the field for me. I changed careers, I had to refuel the engine such that I could actually graduate with an economics degree. But thankfully, right? Yeah, thank you, Ellen.
Where would we be without you?
Yeah. So, people make decisions. They change their minds. They get opportunities that they didn't foresee, and they get interests that grow and mature over time. And so, these are the questions I think that we're really talking about today. So, that was kind of my spiel about understanding how we can get focused participation so that people are making less of, starts and stops, investing tremendously in education that doesn't lead them to where they want to be, and then the other question being, how do we encourage meaningful access? And that is where I'm hoping to do a nice soft handoff to our
Thank you, Matt.
esteemed colleague.
What we anticipate